Greetings! In today's video, we'll be taking a look at a pair of vintage palettes. I got these as a set from eBay. One is a Schmincke palette, the other is a pocket palette from Winsor & Newton, often found in Cotman sets. The Schmincke set has a color chart, while the Winsor & Newton one is a total unknown. My plan is to clean up both palettes and pans as best I can and use them for painting. The first thing I did here was to try and pry out some of the pans from the Schmincke set. With no success. I also tried to remove the pans from the Winsor & Newton set and they were quite stuck in. I switched tactics and decided to swatch the paints as is first. They were all relatively easy to reactivate, and the colors came out nice and strong. It's a really nice assortment of colors. It's a bit hard to say if the paints are professional or student range, but with that kind of color payoff, I'm tempted to think that it's all professional range. Hopefully, cleaning up the pans will provide more information. After the paints had dried, I went for a second attempt at removing the pans. The Schmincke palette seems to have been used quite a lot, and the pans are rather crusty. I managed to take them all out and got to see the tray. It's pretty dirty and covered with what I assume is paint. The tray is still removable, so it's not completely glued in there. There seems to be a bit of rust, but it's hard to say for sure with the layers of crusted paints. For the Winsor & Newton palette, I used a sturdy palette knife as a lever to pry out the pans. It was a bit of a dance between pushing the palette knife between the pan and the space in the palette, and then trying to pull out the pan with the palette knife, and if that was done somewhat enough, I could then use the palette knife as a lever more. The palette itself is also messy, but as it's all plastic, it will be much easier to clean out. When I was done removing the pans, I took the palettes to the bathroom sink to clean them out. I did not record this process, but I took my time, used some lukewarm water and also a stiff paintbrush to clean up the palettes. The Schmincke palette had some crusted acrylic paint, I think, so I used a plastic scraping tool to gently scratch it off. I didn't want to mess up the enamel, so I made sure I was gentle for this step. Sadly enough, fingernails are also quite handy at this point, but yeah, my fingernails are not the best, so it made for a couple of painful fingers. The next thing to clean was the pans themselves. They were coated in all sorts of dry paint. I used a wet rag to rub off the paint. It's one of the rags I used when painting as well. When they are too dirty, I just put them in the wash on their own and reuse them. The cleaning up of the pans allowed me to see the name of some of the pans, mostly the Winsor & Newton ones. Winsor & Newton usually prints directly on the pan the info about the color, like the name and the number, so that's usually more permanent. I saw from that many of the paints were not in their original pans. It seems that at some point some paint cakes got out of their pans and were put in just about any pan, so there will be a bit of figuring out to do here. The Schmincke pans were harder to identify, as most of the labels are stickers and were completely stained and impossible to read. Also, stickers, they're not as permanent, so whenever I would try to wash the pans, more often than not the sticker would just peel off or tear off. For these colors, the handmade chart that came with the Schmincke palette will be most useful. The plastic Winsor & Newton palette was, like I said, the easier one to clean. Since it's all plastic, I just put it right under the faucet and used the same stiff brush to remove the paint. Then it was the simple task of putting the pans back in. I tried to match the paint cakes with their corresponding pans as much as possible. I also had to find a suitable extra empty pan to put the lone paint cake in it, because there was a single paint cake without a pan in that palette. The Schmincke tin was much harder to clean up. There was a fair amount of rust and dried acrylic. It took me a long time. As for the rust itself, I don't know of a way to remove it, so I just cleaned it up as best I could and let it dry completely. And when the tin was dry, I put the pans back in. I had to reshuffle the pans a tiny bit, and since the Schmincke pans are a bit larger than the Winsor & Newton ones, I had a bit of a harder time fitting in all the pans in the top row, but they're okay. They kind of fit. I'll take it. I have a short segment here in the video comparing my first Winsor & Newton pocket palette that I purchased many years ago to the vintage one. They are very similar. I don't think the design for this palette has changed really in the last, 30-40 years, possibly. The only difference I noticed was that the number in the lid is not the same, but I am not sure what it refers to. I also compared the vintage Schmincke palette to my regular Schmincke palette, the one that I bought a few years ago. The main interesting thing to come out of this for me is the different logos. I was able to find a chart on the Schmincke website that explained how the vintage palette's logo was in use from 1980 to 2000, and my regular palette has the latest logo version, the one from 2000 to now. I have no idea how old the vintage palette actually is, but it's 20 years old at the youngest. The last thing I did was to swatch out the colors on both palettes, again, with what I presume is the name of the color, as far as I can tell. You may be wondering what was the whole point of this video, or what is the whole appeal of buying a vintage palette. I think it's a personal choice. I love vintage palettes. I'm fascinated by other people's color choices, what their palettes look like. I have a whole folder of images of artist palettes saved up in my things, and I find it super inspiring. I also really love things that have some life to them, some hidden history. I am not bothered by stains or small areas of rust. I much prefer a palette with some wear to it rather than a brand new, sparkly clean palette. And for me, it's also a bit of history of a medium I love a lot. These palettes are recent history, but I also have a couple of metal palettes that are much older. And it's really interesting to see how that object has evolved over time. The downside of vintage palettes is that they are often in poor shape and sold at a ridiculously high price, since they are vintage. I want palettes I can use to paint, not palettes to use as decor. Too much rust or a busted palette is not what I'm looking for. And I saw some of those online for a really high price. I wanted to record the process of cleaning up these two palettes, just for fun. It was a fun task, and I'm happy to use the palettes for painting now, and I'm happy to share my process of cleaning the palettes with you guys. What do you think? How do you feel about vintage, used palettes? Can you tolerate stains on your palette, or does it have to be pristine? Let me know in the comments below. Take care, bye bye.